They said Africa would always beg for food. They said nations with no ports, no oceans, no power would never control the flow of grain. They said Burkina Faso's place was to wait for aid, not to feed the world. But last week, one signature shattered that illusion. A landlocked country once mocked as powerless has signed a $14 billion food agreement with India, an earthquake in global politics disguised as a grain deal. Think about it. In Washington, senators scrambled to emergency hearings. In Brussels, ministers whispered of instability. Markets shook, traders panicked, and journalists rushed to their cameras, not because of oil, not because of uranium, not because of gold, but because of millet and maize. The world is terrified of African grain. Why? Because food is power. For decades, the West controlled wheat and rice like weapons. They decided who would eat and who would starve, who would bend and who would resist. But today, Burkina Faso has flipped the script. Grain has become Africa's gunpowder. A bag of sorghum now carries more weight than a barrel of crude. This is not a story of pity or aid. This is a story of sovereignty. A country without a coast is preparing to send millions of tons of food across oceans it does not even touch. A people dismissed as poor farmers are now dictating terms to one of the largest nations on earth. And the old empires are watching in fear, because if Burkina Faso can do this, the entire Sahel can follow. So here is the question for you. Is this just a grain deal, or the first shot in a new global food war? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you want to stay ahead of stories that mainstream media will never show you, hit subscribe right now, because what comes next will shake every certainty you thought you had. 14B, grain deal that terrifies Washington. When the world first read the headline, India signs a $14 billion grain deal with Burkina Faso, most thought it was a typo. How could a landlocked country with no coastline, often portrayed as fragile and dependent, suddenly rise as a supplier of food to one of the most powerful nations on earth? Yet the ink was real, the signatures authentic, and the shock immediate. The deal covers massive shipments of sorghum and maize, staples that may not sound glamorous in Western capitals, but are lifelines for hundreds of millions in South Asia. For India, this is more than trade. It is survival. A nation of 1.4 billion people cannot afford hunger. And for Burkina Faso, this is more than export. It is emancipation. A country once forced to sell cheap and buy high is now rewriting the rules. What makes this deal extraordinary is not just the dollar figure, but the infrastructure behind it. Burkina Faso has no ports of its own, yet it mapped a network of corridors stretching through Ghana, Côte d'Ivoire, and Togo. Railways were upgraded, storage silos expanded, and transport hubs reinforced. India agreed not only to purchase grain, but to co-invest in the arteries that would carry it to the sea. In doing so, a supposed weakness, being landlocked, was turned into a strategic weapon. Distance became leverage, not limitation. For years, Western powers dictated African trade through tariffs, quotas, and endless development aid tied to political obedience. Farmers in Burkina Faso sweated under the sun, only to watch profits vanish across oceans. The West wanted raw grain cheap, while selling back expensive chemicals, machinery, and loans. India broke that cycle. It came not with demands for political submission, but with offers of technology, irrigation systems, cold storage facilities, and guaranteed markets. That difference matters. In Washington, lawmakers call this deal reckless. In Brussels, officials mutter about market instability. But what they really fear is loss of control. Because if Burkina Faso can secure a fair partnership with India, why would any African nation continue to accept crumbs from Europe? Why would Niger, Mali, or Guinea still play by colonial trade rules when they can feed Asia directly? The shockwaves go beyond economics. Grain is politics. Whoever controls food controls nations. The West has long used wheat as a weapon, sanctioning those who defied it. But now, Africa is wielding its soil as strength. A shipment of millet can now bend markets as surely as a barrel of oil once did. And every ship leaving African shores with Burkina Faso's grain declares one thing: the monopoly of the West is broken. This is why analysts are scrambling. Not because sorghum is exotic, not because maize is rare, but because for the first time, Africa has proven it can flip dependence into dominance. A landlocked nation has become a cornerstone of global food security, and the empires of the past are no longer laughing. So ask yourself, if grain from Burkina Faso can shake Washington, what will happen when the entire Sahel stands together? Panic in Washington. Africa's grain revolution begins. The day the deal was announced, you could almost hear the silence breaking inside Western capitals. In Washington, senators demanded emergency hearings. How could a landlocked African nation threaten the stability of global markets? One lawmaker shouted behind closed doors. The real fear was not sorghum or maize. It was the precedent. If Burkina Faso could flip dependency into dominance, then the old system was crumbling. Across the Atlantic, Brussels released carefully worded statements about trade stability and market balance. But behind those polished words was panic. For decades, Europe held the leash on African food exports, fixing prices, setting quotas, and suffocating farmers with regulations. Now, that leash had snapped. What terrified them most was not losing grain. It was losing control. Western media swung into action. Headlines screamed reckless, dangerous, unsustainable. Talk show pundits framed the deal as a political gamble that would backfire. But notice the pattern. No one questioned India's hunger. No one denied Africa's capacity to produce. The attacks were aimed at power, at the audacity of a nation once dismissed as powerless, now dictating terms. In contrast, celebrations erupted in Ouagadougou. Farmers who once felt invisible saw their work broadcast across global networks. Mothers carried banners reading, "Our fields feed nations." Youth chanted, "We are not beggars, we are suppliers." For the first time, the world's poorest country by GDP per capita was not begging for food, it was exporting dignity. And in New Delhi, the reaction was equally bold. The Indian Prime Minister declared, "This is not just a trade deal, it is a declaration of independence from the stranglehold of Western food monopolies." The message was clear. India was betting on Africa's soil instead of Western promises. But with boldness came retaliation. Within days, Washington hinted at tariffs on Indian exports. Brussels floated sanctions disguised as quality checks. Western think tanks began publishing reports warning of instability in the Sahel, code words for regime change whispers. Yet Burkina Faso did not blink. Ibrahim Traoré's government doubled down, announcing new plans to integrate Niger and Mali into a broader food corridor. This was the true climax. Food was no longer just food. It had become a weapon of defiance. The same way oil reshaped the 20th century, grain was now reshaping the 21st. And this time, the empire was not in London, Paris, or Washington. It was in the dusty fields of West Africa. The West fears chaos. But maybe, just maybe, what they call chaos is simply freedom they cannot control. And that is where I turn to you. If Africa can make the world tremble with grain, what happens when it does the same with uranium, oil, and lithium? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget, subscribe now, because the next chapter will reveal the storm that no one is prepared to face. From dust to power, how farmers became Burkina Faso's soldiers. The ink on the $14 billion deal had barely dried when the true impact began to ripple across Burkina Faso itself. For decades, the country's farmers were invisible, bent over fields of maize and sorghum, mocked as powerless laborers producing crops for others' profit. But now, they were no longer forgotten. They had become the backbone of a revolution. In the villages, crowds gathered around radios, listening to announcements with disbelief. Farmers who had once been forced to sell their grain for pennies suddenly realized their sweat had global value. They were not just tillers of soil, they were soldiers in a new war. A war fought not with guns, but with harvests. Across Ouagadougou, murals appeared overnight, painting farmers as national heroes, their hoes and sickles drawn like weapons of defiance. The political effect was immediate. Ibrahim Traoré, once portrayed in Western headlines as a reckless young soldier, now stood taller than ever. His gamble had paid off. The deal proved he could deliver not only speeches, but concrete results. His approval ratings surged as farmers' unions, youth groups, and market traders all rallied behind him. The message was clear. This was not just a government victory, it was a people's victory. Economically, the impact spread like wildfire. Storage facilities that once stood half empty were now expanding. Rural roads, long neglected, became arteries of national pride. Investment in irrigation turned dry land into fertile plots. For the first time, children in farming families could dream of education funded not by aid, but by the fruits of their own labor. Pride replaced despair. Hope replaced dependency. But every gain came with shadows. Western pressure mounted. Aid packages were suddenly reassessed. Loans from international banks were delayed for review. Non-governmental organizations quietly warned of humanitarian risks as a veiled threat. The old powers were not going to watch Burkina Faso walk free without a fight. Yet the people's mood was unshakable. They had already tasted what it meant to stand tall, and no sanction could erase that feeling. Beyond Burkina Faso, the symbolism spread like wildfire. In Bamako, in Niamey, in Conakry, leaders pointed to the deal as proof that Africa could negotiate as an equal. Farmers across the Sahel saw in Burkina Faso's success a mirror of their own potential. If one landlocked country could bend the arc of global trade, why not them? This was not just a deal, it was a declaration. And yet, perhaps the greatest consequence is this. For the first time in modern history, Africa's poorest are no longer begging to survive. They are demanding to be heard. A bag of millet has become a manifesto. A ship of maize has become a symbol of sovereignty. The old world order is cracking, and its weakest link, the African farmer, has suddenly become its sharpest weapon. The question is no longer whether Burkina Faso can survive the storm. The real question is, can the world survive a rising Africa? If you believe these truths must not be buried, share your voice in the comments. And hit subscribe, because the next revelation will expose how this grain deal is already reshaping alliances across continents. Why Washington fears a bag of African grain. In the halls of Washington, the mood was unmistakable. Fear wrapped in denial. Senators convened late-night hearings, intelligence briefings were called, and one phrase echoed behind closed doors: food security is national security. What shocked them was not just the size of the $14 billion deal. It was the symbolism. For the first time, an African nation had bypassed the Western gatekeepers and struck directly at the global food order. The United States had long relied on control of food chains to maintain leverage. Wheat shipments, grain subsidies, food aid packages, all had been weapons of influence. But now, a country once dismissed as irrelevant had shown that Africa could become a supplier, not a supplicant. Analysts warn that if Burkina Faso could feed India, the ripple effect could destabilize Western dominance across Africa and Asia. "We've lost the narrative," one congressional aide whispered. In Brussels, the reaction was no less dramatic. European ministers spoke of market disruptions and the need for safeguards. But what they really meant was panic. Europe's influence in Africa had rested on trade agreements that favored the West and locked farmers into cycles of dependency. But if India and potentially China could partner with Africa on equal terms, Europe's centuries-old grip would be broken. Behind the polished speeches lay a truth they dared not admit. They feared irrelevance. Elsewhere, the responses painted a stark divide. In Beijing, the announcement was welcomed with open arms. Chinese state media hailed it as proof that the global South was rising together. In Moscow, commentators declared that the multipolar world is no longer an idea, it is reality. Across Latin America and Southeast Asia, leaders quietly celebrated, seeing Burkina Faso as a symbol of defiance against a system that had kept their own nations down. The shock was not only geopolitical, it was psychological. For decades, the image of Africa in Western minds was one of famine, weakness, and aid dependency. But the deal shattered that narrative. Overnight, Africa transformed from a receiver of charity to a broker of survival. The very grain once used to justify pity was now a weapon of pride. And that shift terrified the old powers more than any missile or tank. What comes next is even more dangerous for the West. If food can empower Africa, what happens when uranium, oil, and lithium follow the same path? Burkina Faso has lit a fire, and it will spread. The global South is watching, learning, and preparing. For America and Europe, the choice is clear but painful. Adapt to a world where Africa is a partner, or cling to the past and risk losing it all. And so the question remains, will they evolve, or will they try to crush this new order before it grows too strong? Now I ask you, if the world trembles at a bag of African grain, how will it respond when Africa controls the minerals that fuel tomorrow's technology? Tell me in the comments, and make sure you subscribe now, because in the next part, we will reveal how this grain revolution is already reshaping the future of global alliances. The grain deal was only the beginning. The ink may be dry, the signatures sealed, but make no mistake, this is not the end of the story. It is the opening act. Burkina Faso has shown that grain can bend markets, challenge empires, and rewrite alliances. The next question is, where does this path lead? For Burkina Faso, the road ahead is both thrilling and perilous. On one hand, the partnership with India promises not only food exports, but also technology, railways, and ports. If these projects succeed, Ouagadougou could transform from a forgotten capital into a nerve center of the South Grain Corridor, a supply chain independent of Western control. For the first time in history, a landlocked nation could become a hub of global trade. But the risks are real. Western retaliation will not stop at words. Sanctions, tariffs, covert operations. History shows they will use every tool to break what they cannot control. Burkina Faso's gamble will be tested not only in markets, but in politics, in sabotage, and in propaganda. Traoré's leadership will face storms far stronger than headlines, and yet there is an opportunity greater than any risk. If Niger, Mali, and Guinea join this corridor, a regional grain bloc could rise from the Sahel. Imagine a union of farmers across West Africa, controlling food routes from the Sahara to the Indian Ocean. Imagine the same unity applied to uranium, oil, and lithium. The West calls it destabilization, but history may call it liberation. The road ahead is uncertain, but one truth cannot be denied. The world is watching, and every bag of grain shipped, every railway completed, every farmer who lifts his head with pride will make it harder for the old order to drag Africa back down. So I ask you, do you believe this path will lead to freedom or to conflict? Leave your answer in the comments and subscribe now, because in the final part, we will reveal whether this deal is a spark of hope or the opening shot of a global storm. Will Africa's grain spark the next global war? The story began with a single contract, but its echoes may shape the century. $14 billion of grain, sorghum and maize, moving not as food, but as symbols of power. What started in Ouagadougou and New Delhi has now unsettled Washington, shaken Brussels, and emboldened Beijing and Moscow. The world is no longer looking at Burkina Faso as a forgotten corner of Africa. It is staring at a nation daring to redraw the map of power. But the question remains, is this the dawn of liberation, or the first tremor of a storm? History tells us that empires rarely surrender quietly. The West did not control food, gold, and oil for centuries only to give them away without a fight. The sanctions will grow sharper, the propaganda louder, the attempts at destabilization more ruthless. Traoré's government will be tested in ways no contract can shield. And yet, history also whispers another truth. Every empire falls, every chain breaks, every illusion of control eventually crumbles. What Burkina Faso has ignited is not just trade, it is imagination. Across Africa, young farmers and old warriors alike now see that sovereignty is not a dream, but a crop to be planted, watered, and harvested. For the United States and Europe, the danger is not simply losing grain, it is losing the myth that they alone decide the fate of nations. For India and Africa, the opportunity is far larger than trade. It is a chance to build a future where survival does not come at the price of submission. So here we stand, at the edge of a new order. Grain ships sail, farmers cheer, and markets tremble. But the real battle has only begun. Will history remember this as the birth of Africa's independence through food, or as the spark of a global conflict that no one can control? The choice is not theirs alone. It is yours, too. Tell me in the comments, what do you see coming? And if you want to be part of the journey as history unfolds, hit subscribe now, because this story is not ending. It is only beginning.